Chapter 37. When Martin James walked Simon Merriam into the police station at the top of the hill in Maesybont, he found a situation that was more chaotic than he had expected. There was a duty sergeant behind the desk, a large man with a reddish face, whose hair was cut so short it made him seem as if his ears were sticking out, and he didn't have much control over the situation. There was a woman of about 50 or so, with badly dyed red hair, sitting on a bench near the far wall, arguing with a teenager, presumably her son, who wore a black sweatshirt with a hood. Then there was Detective Sergeant Harry Warden, looking quite different in jeans, sneakers, and a black leather jacket, urgently talking into a mobile phone while leaning against the counter. "As soon as possible, then, Chief," Warden was saying to the mouthpiece. "Can't do any more than that, can we?" When Harry Warden put the phone down, he turned in Martin James's direction, and Martin couldn't help noticing that he seemed surprised to see him. Taller than Martin had previously noticed, and because of the way he was dressed, Harry Warden also seemed younger. But this night, despite the fact that it was now almost 10:30 and he'd obviously been off duty before being summoned back to work, there was a tension about the sergeant that indicated he was not to be trifled with. He looked in Martin's direction, and then his eyes flicked across to Simon Merriam, who, despite a shower and shave before they'd set off from London, now looked rather the worse for wear. He only had a t-shirt on under his suit jacket, which he clutched around him in a way that showed that he was feeling the cold. His black hair had fallen over his face, and he seemed to be looking at the floor rather than at anyone. "Yes," Harry Warden said. He was obviously in a hurry. "You need to talk to him," Martin began, gesturing in Simon Merriam's direction. "You need to talk to him about Samantha." "I do? Why?" "Because she wasn't there at Tretherick Rectory the morning that Parker Merriam went into the gully. And he was." "Who says so?" "He does. He will, if you ask him." And so began the series of events that afterwards seemed to Martin James to be the start of the longest and perhaps most significant night of his life. Harry Warden turned towards Simon Merriam and said to him, "Is this true?" When Simon Merriam seemed initially reluctant to say anything, Martin had a moment when he envisaged having to begin it all over again. He thought for a moment how much his life had changed since his first encounter with Gwendryth James that morning on the track going down to the rectory. How far back into the history of his own family he'd gone, and how far he was still going. He felt suddenly tired. The adrenaline that had kept going for the last few hours of his drive now seemed on the verge of petering out. "You'd better come with me," Harry Warden said, and taking a bunch of keys from behind the counter, led them downstairs towards the interview room. But once there, in that bare, official-looking room with a metal table and chairs, the interview that Martin expected did not take place. Something else, something important, was obviously going on in Harry Warden's mind. Once he had confirmed from Simon Merriam the essential facts of the case, he told him he was going to hold him overnight to confirm what he'd said was true. Then, after he'd summoned the duty sergeant to take Simon Merriam into custody, Sergeant Harry Warden turned to Martin James and said, "Thank you. It's been a busy night." It was not until Martin James had returned to Plas Wern Las and then had to go out again that he realized how much of an understatement what Harry Warden had said was. For a moment, though, as he approached the familiar, elegant outline of the mansion, what he felt mostly was a sense of release. A light burned deep within the house, probably from the kitchen, and the outside porch light threw another light pool in front of the well-proportioned windows. It was a dry night for Wales, and a sliver of moon was visible over the mountain. For a moment, it seemed to Martin that he understood what the struggle for possession of the place was all about. Even Wyndham Spencer Jones's unreasonable greed began to make sense. For there, in the moonlight, Plas Wern Las seemed to be in obvious harmony with its surroundings, seemed to sit on its own plateau of land in perfect proportions, an elegance that reached outside itself. Martin sat in the Land Rover and looked at the house for a moment. Then he parked the vehicle around the back of the house and went into Plas Wern Las through the other door. 3 women sat on stools around the long table in the kitchen with large white mugs of cocoa in front of them. There was Jane Merriam, looking as elegant as ever, with a blue cashmere scarf thrown over an off-white sweater. Marion Keynes in a denim jacket and skirt. And a younger woman with long auburn hair and pale skin, whom Martin hadn't seen before. "Martin," Marion Keynes said as soon as he came through the door, "we were just talking about you. I want you to meet Mary Seymour, who's come to help us out." It was typical of Marion Keynes's resourcefulness, Martin thought, that even in a situation as difficult as the present one, she had no intention of giving in. Queenie Rogers might be dead. Samantha Merriam, despite his best efforts, might still be in jail. But Marion Keynes was determined to continue with her efforts to keep Plas Wern Las going as a retreat. He then said hello to Mary Seymour, who seemed pleasant enough, if a little nervous. Not that he could blame her. Coming into a situation like this must be difficult. God knows it was difficult enough for him to concentrate on meeting someone new when the events of the past 24 hours were still reverberating. He was about to explain to the others what had happened when the phone rang in Marion Keynes' office and she went to answer it. "David Young is missing," Jane Merriam explained to Martin without any prompting. "No one has seen him since this morning, and Marion is doing her best to keep calm about it. Her car's gone as well." Martin began to wonder about this strange conjunction of events and whether they were all related. He didn't have to wait long. A few minutes later, Marion Keynes came back into the kitchen. She was obviously doing her best to keep things under control. She put her hands on the edge of the refectory table, and then she said, "That was the police. They've decided to release Samantha, keep Simon in custody. They were sending her home in a car, but there was an emergency and they were apparently diverted to Llyn Castle. That's where she is now." When Jane Merriam immediately started to ask questions, Martin explained what had happened as best he could. She wasn't pleased, but then he could hardly expect her to be. One of her offspring had been released, but the other one had been incarcerated, all in a single night. And that night was far from over. Martin then promised that he would drive her over to Llyn Castle, which was situated on the estuary about 5 miles away from Plas Wern Las. Jane Merriam said she would go with him. There was no choice.